right, welcome to episode 16 of the Bulldog Bark podcast. I am yours truly, the Guru. I got my full cast with me today. We got BFC, Michael DeRosa, and Kyle the Butler fan. Big special guest today, one of the many great bracketologists, T3 Bracketology. If you guys don't already follow him, please do. He provides great knowledge, and now that Butler is definitely a relevant team this year, pretty exciting stuff. I would definitely give him a follow. He's going to break down Butler's resume for us today. The Dogs are coming off a tough-fought loss at the number one UConn Huskies. Great battle, 71-62. Really actually didn't kill their metrics, which I'm sure T3 will talk about a little bit here. But I'm going to punt it over to T here. He's going to break down Butler's resume. We'll do a little Q&A at the end, and that'll be this episode for us. So T, I'm going to pass it over to you, man. Kind of break down this Butler resume for us. We're excited this year, so ready to hear about it.
Yeah, absolutely. This has been a fun team to watch. Butler's always at the NCAA tournament's always more fun when you have Butler in there too. There were some of those really fun teams with Gordon Hayward back in the day that just made March Madness so much more fun. But as I start this, if anyone that's listening to this wants to follow along with what I look at and how I evaluate resumes, one of the best things you can do is go to warrennolan.com, and then you can just sort by men's basketball, net, and then you can see all the different team sheets. It goes to all 362, even Chicago State, my beloved Cougars. You can still look at their team sheet. They're not eligible. They're not making the dance. They don't even have a conference. But you can still look at their team sheet. It's pretty sick. So as you're following along with this, if you want to go to warrennolan.com, you can see a lot of the same stuff that I'm looking at. So we'll break through first. There are technically 5 major metrics, but the fifth one, why I say technically, is net. And for Butler right now, that is 50. And the reason why I say technically for that one is, and I've tweeted about this many times, net really is a sorting tool, not a power ranking. It's not something that, it's on the team sheet. It's something that the committee will look at, but it's not really something that's going to determine too often if a team makes the tournament, what the seed is. We've seen teams in the Rutgers a couple of years ago was a 77 in the net. They got in. Same teams that year were low 40s, high 30s. Missed the tournament. So obviously with that 30 to 40 spot difference, not really a huge deal. That is on there. For Butler, that's 50, but there's not really much to speak about that too much. That's more of if another team's playing Butler, they care a lot about Butler's net. But for Butler, it's not going to impact all of your guys' chances of making the tournament, what your seed is. But the 4 metrics that do, those are broken into 2 buckets. That's result-based metrics and then predictive metrics. There are 2 in each. There used to be a third. It's called SAG. The person that runs that metric's not doing it this year. So just for now, there's 2 result-based and 2 predictive. So first, within the result-based metrics, we have KPI and then strength of record. And both of those are really looking at truly what are the wins and losses. That's what KPI does. It just gives it a score for each win and loss, depending on how good it is, basis the proprietary formula that's in there. And then it kind of ranks all those teams based on that score. And then strength of record is looking at how the average top 25 team can achieve your given record. So in this particular case, right now, as of February 7th, Butler is 14-8 with the 5th best schedule based on net strength of schedule, 88th non-conference. So based on that, what is the odds that the average top 25 team could achieve that 14-8 record with those margins? And that's what strength of record is. And then predictive metrics, there's 2 more there. There's BPI, which is the metric that ESPN uses. You can find that if you just Google ESPN BPI. You can see that ranking there. That's also where you can find strength of record. There's a tab that says, I think it's resume near the top. You click on that and you can sort by SOR too. And then the last one is KenPom, which I feel like most people are the most familiar with. It's probably the most, no metric is perfect, but it's probably the most accurate metric in terms of like how good are these teams, offensive, defensive efficiency, things like that. So knowing that ahead of time, those are the 4 main metrics, and there's obviously the quads. We'll get into that in a second. But firstly, let's just break down what are, as of, again, February 7th, I'm sure if you're listening to this on the 8th, the 9th, some of these numbers could change. Butler does not play again until the 10th, so it shouldn't change too much, but obviously some things can change in there. But in terms of result-based metrics, KPI is 54 for Butler, and SOR is 38. So immediately what jumps off for me for that is SOR is great. Like a 38 strength of record. There are teams that have worse strength of records that are seeded better than Butler. I currently have Butler as of today as a 10 seed. I don't see that changing until the weekend. And then the KPIs where there's a little bit more of a struggle there, that is really because, again, it's that formula that tracks wins and losses. It's usually a little bit slower to get after the wins. I think a really great example is if you're following along with this and you're on Warren Nolan, take a look at Iowa State's resume. They had a really poor non-conference. They were over 300. Their strength of record's catching up to the great wins they're getting, including yesterday they won at Texas, but their KPI is still in the 30s. So it's catching up to that. So if Butler continues to play the way they're playing, those Marquette and Creighton road wins continue to age well, which I would imagine they're still going to be at least solid. KPI will catch up. But for right now, as a projection, that's another reason why, yes, we street strength of record is 38, but if you average out 38 and 54, I think it's in the mid to high 40s. And so that really does still indicate a bubble team. You really want to try to be under 50 from a result-based metric standpoint to be in the field. That's like that first really criteria. And Butler's just underneath that. And the main reason why it's not better is because KPI is at 54. And then predictive metrics, these are important in terms of getting into the field, but it's really more emphasized for seeding. And I think it's going to be the main thing that not really worries me, because I'm not as worried right now about Butler getting into the field as I am about getting a good seed. And the major reason for that is because KenPom sits at 46, just solid. It's not too bad. But BPI currently sits at 66. So if you think about an average between those two, that's 56. If you think about the at-large teams that make it, there's 36 spots for at-large teams. And then if you think about some other leagues that usually get multiple bids, it usually gets to around like spot 46 or so. Like you'll have a 12 seed that's a play-in, an 11 seed that's a play-in team in Dayton, and then it goes from there. So that usually gets to about 46 on the seed list. So a 56 overall predictive metric is obviously 10 spots higher than that criteria. So that's something that's going to hold you back. I know a team like South Carolina that now has single digit in the result-based metrics is still only a 5 seed because their predictive metrics are in the 40s. It's not really my favorite thing, to be honest, but it's something that not just myself and many bracketologists have noticed is very important for seeding wise. So those are two numbers to keep in mind for Butler as that goes on. One of the things that unfortunately impacts that is just margin of victory. And there's just some games for Butler in the non-conference, like the Cal game comes to mind, which Cal's gotten better. They're not as bad as they were when Butler played them, but that margin being a little bit closer, only beating Buffalo by 13, which you're like, why does that matter that much? It really shouldn't, to be honest. But those are the things that impact those numbers. And unfortunately, over time, they add up and those are in the metrics. I wish it wasn't involved there as much, to be honest. But those are really the things to keep an eye on. It's the result-based metrics are what's going to get you into the field, along with the quad numbers, which we'll talk about in a second. Predictives gives you the seeding, and then really the full package is kind of looked together in terms of that gets you into different groups in terms of like, is Butler in the 6 to 7 seed discussion or the 8 to 9, or right now they're in the 9 to 10 seed discussion. Like you get into those groups by the full team sheet, and then each individual metric plays a role in terms of where you exactly get. And then looking at the rest of the team sheet, like I said, there is strength of schedule overall, which the one that the committee is going to use the most often is net strength of schedule. It's just your strength of schedule based on the team's nets that you've played against. For Butler, that's 5. So that's pretty fantastic. You can obviously ask for 1, 2, 3, or 4, but 5 solid enough. And then non-conference is a sneaky one, especially if in Butler's upcoming schedule there are a few more losses and it gets a little bit more bubbly. That's an area in the non-conference strength of schedule that's kept some teams out. Rutgers and Clemson last year both had non-conference strength of schedules over 300. And that was something that the committee specifically cited after the fact and said that that was a reason why they left them out. They didn't challenge themselves at all. They had some bad losses. They had really great wins. Rutgers even beat Purdue a couple times last year. Didn't get in. Too many bad losses, over 300, non-conference strength of schedule. But for Butler, as of 2-7, it's 88. So not a problem for you guys whatsoever. It's another box to check. That's not going to be something that you have to worry about at the end of the season, but just for future reference. And so then we get into the thing that I think probably people here talked about the most, and that's the quads. That's stuff that's broken into quad 1, quad 2, quad 3, and quad 4. And it's based on your opponent's net. That's why I'm always kind of harping on that it's not really so much about your own net, but what your opponent's net is. So I'm not really going to get in too much into the actual specific numbers of quad 3 and quad 4, because I could sit here all day and break out every little number breakdown of what gets into that. But what's most important about quad 3 and quad 4 is those would be considered bad losses. Quad 4 is the worst, especially if it's at home. A road quad 4 loss, which doesn't happen too often, but a team that most people are familiar with now after last year that does have one is FAU. They lost at Florida Gulf Coast. That's a quad 4 loss, but it's not nearly as bad as, say, Northwestern, who lost at home to Chicago State, because it's a home loss in quad four. So there is some sort of differentiation there, even if the nets are pretty close. And then quad threes, you can definitely afford those. Like if we go through the rest of Butler's schedule, if Butler added one quad three loss, I don't think that's the worst thing in the world. Teams have gotten in. I mean, there's teams in right now that have two, like Texas A&M. Villanova is first four out, next four out, depending on who you ask. They have three quad three losses, all in Big Five in the non-conference. So certainly you can get in with those, but those are two things that really benefit Butler right now. Also, is there's a nice zero. The worst loss that's closest is Seton Hall, which is, I mean, it's unfortunate for Seton Hall that their net's so low on a lot of their metrics because they're a lot better than 65th anyways. But that's still 11 spots away from being quad three. Seton Hall would kind of have to fall off the surface from how they've played. Maybe Kadari Richmond has a second injury, a setback, and then that really sets them. I think that's the only way they fall that far is if he has a secondary injury and then they fall back. But that's the only loss that's really even anywhere close to being quad three. For it to be a road loss, it has to be 136. So that's just DePaul in the Big East that's left. I don't think Butler still plays Georgetown again. If they do, then that's something that would fall in there. But if they don't, then that's fine. So it really is just DePaul. And in DePaul's case, that's quad four. So there might not even be any quad three losses that are left anyways. And then obviously you have quad one and quad two. So we'll break into what those exactly look like as well. So for quad one, it's any home game that's top 30 in the net, any neutral game that's top 50 in the net. So a lot of teams, if they beat Butler neutral, they're looking at Butler right at 50, like we hope that stays quad one. That's kind of the example of what you look at an opponent's net. And then away is anything top 75. And then an additional note within quad one that we have noticed, the committee hasn't specifically said it, but myself and a lot of others have noticed it's pretty important, is actually quad 1A. And it's the upper echelon, upper tier of quad one. So that's going to be a top 15 home win, top 25 neutral, and top 40 road win. So for Butler right now, both the Marquette and the Creighton wins are not only road quad one wins, they're road quad 1A. And that's something that's going to differentiate themselves a ton if it does get a little bit more bubbly where it comes down to mid-late March and we're talking about Butler last four in. That's something that's going to be a huge differentiator. There's no one else in the bubble right now that has two quad 1A road wins. It's not just quad 1A wins, it's quad 1A wins away from home in true road games. And right now, I'm not really, because they're both road, Marquette and Creighton are not going to fall out of the top 40. And they'd have to lose out. They're too good. They're not going to lose out. So those are going to be fine. And then Butler does also have a third quad one win, which is Boise State. That was a neutral court in the non-conference, and that currently sits 40th. It's a little bit close to being quad two, but Boise State's a pretty good team. They have enough easy wins, you'd think, in the Mountain West to probably stay above 50, but definitely something to keep an eye on there for sure. And then another one additionally is a Texas Tech win, which feels like in some weeks for Butler, it looks really good. Now Texas Tech's lost 3 in a row. Still is great, but it slipped into Q2. Texas Tech's currently 36 in the net. So if that can get back up to 30, that's a fourth quad one win for Butler. But right now, Butler currently sits at 3-7 in quad one. So it's great to have 3 quad one wins, but the overall record and how you actually take advantage of your opportunities too is something that the committee does value. So that's something that we're seeing too with like a Michigan State. They're 2-7 in quad one. It's great that they have 2 quad one wins, but the overall record does also matter, both with quad one and then combining the two as well, quad one and quad two. So if you look at quad two for Butler, they're 2-1. They had the Texas Tech and Villanova wins, and then that loss we talked about to Seton Hall. So if you combine those two together, that's a 5-8 quad one, quad two record. So that's not great. You obviously have 5 combined wins. That's what's getting Butler into the field, but it's another factor on top of those predictive metrics and the KPI of why Butler sits in a double-digit seed today and not higher, even though they have those 2 road wins. And then kind of the last thing that I would add, this is if it gets really bubbly, is we do notice that a lot of teams tend to have a really hard time getting an at-large bid if they're under 500 against quads 1 through 3 combined. And that's really a big case of maybe it's a resume like Butler, where right now they're 5-8. Yeah, 5-8 versus quad 1 and quad 2. And if you add quad 3 in there, they're 8-8. So that is getting pretty close. Obviously, if they're 8, we have seen some teams that have been 1 or 2 games under 500, but it does tend to get a little bit more dicey. And that is because that's when teams stack too many quad 4 wins, which in Butler's case, not going to be a huge problem. The only quad 4 game left is DePaul. And obviously, if Butler finishes the season like 2-6, they're not getting in. So if you end up winning at least enough games to get in, that this overall record thing, because it's already 500, is not going to be a problem, because you probably need to go at least 4-4, and we can break down the exact schedule of what games to tier into what when you're looking at the rest of the games. But that's just one last thing that's important. And then the final thing I'll say, and then we can kind of get into other things off the team sheet, is just overall record. I know a lot of people like to look at that, what that looks like. It's not too overly important, but I will say that there has been a general rule of thumb that you need to be at least 3 games over 500. Butler right now is 6. So again, if we're talking finishing the year 4-4, not going to be a problem. But that is something like Big East friends like Villanova and Xavier, they're really looking at that. And that's another reason why they have some decent wins themselves. Obviously, they both have much more bad losses than Butler does at the current moment. But their record, I think they're both only 2 games over. Maybe one of them's 3 games. I think they're both 12-10, but whatever the case is, it's close. So that's where it does start to become a factor. The Big 12 is going to obviously be another league where there's going to be a ton of teams that are looking like that because that league's so tough. Big East is very similar. ACC, not so much like years past, maybe like really all the other power leagues. It's something that to keep in mind, but not really as important until you're closer to that threshold. So that kind of sums up at least the team sheet part, but I didn't know if you guys had any other questions too, or I can walk through the schedule as well.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for that whole breakdown. That was awesome.
Yeah.
Maybe let's take a quick second here to ask a few questions just based on everything that was just given to us right there. And guys, I'll start maybe BFC or Michael or Kyle. If you guys have a question first, I'll let you guys go before I had a couple as well. So Kyle, what's up, man?
Yeah. So really, I think that when it comes to the quads, that's what a lot of people know about. Obviously, when it comes to, would you say, so we talked about Butler not having any Q3 or Q4 losses, which I think looks really good. I've heard the term like clean resume before, as far as like no like real like dirty spots on like, oh, they lost to this team. That's really bad. There's not really any losses that you can point at for Butler like that. And how important is that I know you've talked about how it's different types of metrics are used for getting into the field versus seeding. Do you think that like clean resume type thing is something that the committee really looks at as far as seeding goes, or as far as just like getting into the tournament?
I think it's definitely important for both, but it's a lot more important for getting into the tournament and the selection piece that's really focused more on the results. I think predictive metrics like KenPom and BPI will have some of that baked into it already. So if some of the losses are bad or good and how they age over time, that's going to be baked into those metrics anyways. It's like a great example, like we mentioned before, is FAU. They have 2 really bad losses, but everyone under the sun has them as a 5 or a 6 seed because they've made up for it with wins. They only have 4 losses. They had a good non-conference schedule, even though the American's down. So I think it's a lot more about for Butler, if they keep both of the Q3 and Q4 to 0, that really raises the odds. I think a great example to look back on is NC State from last year. Like a very underwhelming resume. There was not a lot there. I think they had like 1 good road win. I think they only had 2 quad 1 wins. Decent amount in quad 2, which is kind of like the new ACC thing anyways. Not really a lot of quad 1 opportunities. But they had a 0 in quad 2 or quad 3 and quad 4, and not a lot of quad 2 losses. And that's what Butler's doing. 7 of their 8 losses are quad 1. So that's really important in terms of the seeding piece, but you're still going to pick up, or the selection piece, but you're still going to pick up some losses. So that could end up impacting seed. But that's one of the best parts about Butler's resume right now, is that there's a 0 in both those categories.
So I've got a question. Yeah, real quick. I know the answer to this one, but I feel like it'd be better if you could explain it to the audience. Butler's beaten Boise State and like other bubble teams. Like there are some other Big East teams on the bubble. Like you mentioned Villanova, Xavier earlier, etc. Does the head-to-head really matter? How does it matter in like, say, if Butler splits with Xavier and they sweep Villanova or something like that? Does that really matter comparing the resumes, or is it more just the entire body of work for the season?
It really is the body of work of the season. But I will say there have been some examples, and we will probably hear it again because there's a lot in the top 16 teams when the reveal. I believe the reveal is February 17th for the top 16. That's the 1 through 4 seeds. There is the occasional thing where if the resumes are really close, they'll honor the head-to-head, especially if it's more recent. So in like the case of Butler versus Boise, where after last night for Boise State, they lost at Colorado State. Weren't really in that game for much. They're a 9 seed, Butler's a 10. Butler were to beat Providence, Boise State loses on Saturday, they're going to get a lot closer. Does that come into play? It really needs to be a really close resume. Right now, Boise State has 5 quad 1 wins, a couple extra quad 2. They're above 500 in quad 1, quad 2. So the resume is just a little bit better. They don't have those 2 huge road wins like Butler does, but that's just 2 games out of 22 on the schedule. So it really only comes into play if they're really close. I think a lot of Clemson fans, as an example, were really mad last year. They beat NC State 2 or 3 times. NC State got in, Clemson did not, because of the full body of work. I mean, Clemson even had better wins, but they had, like I said, I think it was like 330th out of 362 non-conference strength of schedule. They had 4 bad losses. NC State had 0. So the committee went with the full body of work and said, yes, maybe Clemson's better than NC State, but is that just like a matchup thing? Or is it really like the full season? Sometimes a team just really matches up really well against somebody else, especially if it's been multiple. But in the case of like Butler versus Boise, it would have to be so close in terms of a resume for it to really be a tiebreaker, which does happen occasionally, but not a ton. And we wouldn't ever really know that off of other than like the top 4, because they get their location preference in the protected seeds 1 through 16 overall. But when it gets down into where Butler's going to play, which is probably a ceiling of a 6 all the way down to the last 4 and an 11, anywhere in that in the next month, we probably wouldn't know really if the head-to-head came into play, because it's hard to tell. But to put it the answer the most simply, it's the full body of work. Obviously, is the most important.
Yeah, I just had a quick question, kind of about how if injuries are brought into the equation at all with metrics. So the one that stands out to us would be the Providence game. That team's been in kind of a free fall since the Hopkins injury, but we played them at full strength, took them into overtime and lost in the dunk. So I don't really think it would affect us. That loss is affecting us negatively. But does anything go into that? Like you said, the Kadari Richmond, if he was to, suffer another injury, Butler lost to them at full strength. Is there anything that kind of factors in the difference in a team if they have, some kind of catastrophic injury to a star player?
So I would love to say that the committee gets that deep. I don't even know, if I'm being like fully honest with you, I don't know if they even get as deep as I do without those factors. That's something that actually Lenardi and I talked about earlier this week. We get deeper than the committee. I mean, they haven't even looked at the stuff yet. I've been into this stuff since opening week. So that just is what it is. But unfortunately, in that case, with your 2 examples of those losses, it really seems like the injuries only apply to the actual team it's affecting. So like in Providence's case, Hopkins is done for the year. That's negatively impacting them. They had a couple of nice showings, but overall have just, unfortunately, not looked like the team they looked at the beginning of the year. So they're not a tournament team right now. They can still make up for it. There's over a month left, 5 weeks. But right now, their resume, along with the fact they don't have Hopkins for the rest of the season, is going to impact them. Whereas on the flip side, anyone that lost to Providence is not going to get some benefit of the doubt if, say, like right now, Providence is 58th in the net. So if they were to fall to below 75, which makes that a quad 2 loss, that's still not bad. I don't know if that really moves the needle a ton. And I highly doubt that they're going to get to like 80, 90, where it's a quad 2B loss and get really specific. And who knows if the committee even cares about dividing Q2 up. We've seen references of Q1, but Q2, who knows? So I don't know if that's going to really impact it. Kind of same with Seton Hall if Kadari Richmond's out. But unfortunately, I've never noticed a theme there of a team's win. Like, let's say even if you beat Providence before, and let's say they get somebody back and they play a lot better, or like you beat Seton Hall where they had Richmond out, you're not going to get penalized for that Seton Hall win. Just like you're not going to get a benefit of the doubt for the loss of a team full strength if they're not anymore. It's really just impacting like Seton Hall and Providence specifically, not the teams they played.
Yeah, I got one more question here. And I think this is brought up every year when it gets to, early March. All of these games obviously matter. We know that, but I feel like there's a debate, at least amongst people that aren't super bracketology people, every year about conference tournaments and how much they matter. Obviously they matter for the automatic seed, if some team that was on the bubble or maybe outside looking in wins their tournament, they're in, of course. A team like Butler, let's say they go out and they, get bounced by a Xavier or St. John's first round, depending on who the matchup is, or maybe they win that game and then beat a Marquette or Creighton. how much does the committee take into account conference tournaments? Because I've seen a lot of discourse online the past couple of years about whether or not the committee really gives a crap about the conference tournament. So I'd love to know your thoughts on that.
So the best way to think about conference tournaments is that there is no consistency with them. The general rule of thumb that I try to go with is I try to have a really nice seed list put together that Tuesday of conference tournament week, where there's a couple of those like outlet, like some of the bigger conferences like an ACC, a Big 10, Big 12, maybe opening game. They'll have a couple of games where there's not too much. Wednesdays when it really starts getting kicking that week in the multi-bid leagues. It really doesn't seem like there's a super consistency. For most years, I would say those opening round games, because that's when they're all meeting together again. They're in the room. They're starting to scrub the bracket. They're putting the 1 seeds together, the 2s, the 3s, going down the list, voting teams in. I think those ones are probably more top of mind because they're not computers. They are human beings. So they are seeing the games occur in there. But it does really seem like there's only a few examples where like a Friday, Saturday, Sunday game, other than like you said, if a team actually clinches the AQ for one, especially in those 1 bid leagues, or if it's a bid thief like the Atlantic 10 if Dayton doesn't win it, or the American if FAU doesn't win it. Obviously, they automatically get in. You have to shift some stuff around, and a team's going to lose a bid. Who was the last team in, and then they get their bid stolen in that case. But it really does seem to vary. Most years, I would say it doesn't matter. I mean, Texas A&M 2 years ago is a great example. They didn't have, I mean, they actually had a horrible non-conference. A couple bad losses. Non-conference strength of schedule was over 250. Really didn't do a whole lot until about this time. Then they got really hot. Kind of feels, an example this season feels like Minnesota in the Big 10. Feels like they're starting to play better, but they had a really bad non-conference, the 3rd worst schedule. They didn't beat a team above net 80 until yesterday. So they kind of have to win out to make it. But it's if they finish 7-1, it feels like it's going great and they could go to the Big 10 final and still miss the tournament. So it does really vary. Texas A&M that season 2 years ago missed it. But then on the flip side, I think the committee's kind of heard that noise a lot. And Marquette actually in the Big East was easily a 3 seed, like no question. But they won the Big East tournament on that Saturday. And it did feel like that the committee did give credit to the fact that Marquette won the Big East and the Big East tournament. Completing both of those bumped them up to a 2 seed, and they were 8th overall. So that's where I say there is a lack of consistency. But generally speaking, I think like your example of a Xavier St. John's in the first round could be big in terms of like if it's really bubbly as it last 4 in for Butler, that could be huge. But in terms of that second win, if it's say over Marquette or Creighton, I don't know if that's going to really make a difference between an 11 or a 10 seed, a 10 or a 9 seed, something like that.
All right, and I got 3. 2 are going to be from people that had some questions, and then I just have a general one. And you kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier. You said, you have Butler as a 10 seed, 10, 11, I think you said right about now. I think you said 6, but what do you see as Butler's ceiling going forward as far as how high up they could go? Maybe obviously if you win out, that'd be a crazy scenario, but what do you kind of foresee as Butler's maybe ceiling in the tournament going forward?
I mean, like the highest ceiling realistically, if we're not talking winning out, not losing a game, they get all the way to Saturday in the Big East tournament. And it's like, okay, well, maybe we could talk 5 seed 4. Like it's hard to predict that if you're just winning every game. But just thinking about like the schedule that Butler has left, you still do have 3 home games coming up against, I guess St. John's the bubble team, but you have Marquette and Creighton at home, St. John's in the bubble, Providence, who knows how that's going to age because they could continue to slip. Xavier's another one that who knows, and then a couple of decent road opportunities. Like there's a lot of moral of the story. There's a lot of winnable games. Like the road games that are left, DePaul's a must win, obviously, and then Seton Hall and Villanova are very winnable road games. So there's a potential there of like a 6-2 finish, and that's realistic in there. In that particular case, like a 6-2, just because of where the gaps are now, I feel like those top 5 seeds are just really good. They have some areas, they have a single digit metric. They have no losses outside of Q1. They already have 18 wins. Like it's going to be really hard to get to that rate without just winning out. And even a 6 is going to be tough. But I think like a 6-2 finish, I think it gets really interesting in that case, especially if the losses, maybe it's at Villanova, because that's net 45. So that's just quad 1 loss. Could even be quad 1A loss if Villanova gets a little bit better, up to 40. And then just splitting Marquette Creighton. If those are the 2 losses, winning the rest of them, a lot of other teams around there, I could see it getting to like a 24 overall where it's a 6 seed. I think realistically, if someone's listening, I wouldn't get your hopes up for that. I would say Butler's kind of money zone right now is 7 to 10. Like I think those two road wins are going to be huge. If Butler just does fine, doesn't lose at Seton Hall or doesn't lose at DePaul, winning this weekend would be great against Providence. The home games against Xavier and St. John's, like getting those games, or you could afford to lose an extra one if you can get Creighton or Marquette again at home. I feel like a 7 to 10 is fair because all of those teams are so close. I mean, one or two results come in and I'm flipping a team from an 8 to a 10 just because it fluctuates a lot. I think just the thing like we talked about with Butler's team sheet that holds them back from a 7, because an 8 9, like I prefer to be a 10 over 8 9, because if you win that first game, you don't have to play a 1 seed, you can play a 2 seed. And 3 of the 4 1 seeds, Houston, Purdue, and UConn, people don't want any business with those teams. Maybe Purdue, they've had some struggles, but like probably would prefer to play a 2 seed team. Like Tennessee is really good, but they have scoring droughts, winnable. Butler plays good defense, like more winnable than say Houston would be if you're thinking about the 2 games. So you'd probably prefer a 10 seed anyways, but those predictive metrics, especially BPI being 66, probably holds it back from a 6. 7's the best case. If you just keep stacking wins, you get 6 more. You're probably looking at like 4 or 5 more quad 1 wins. I can see that being the ceiling.
Yeah, and then kind of follow up to that, breaking down. I know you said 6 and 2. I think a lot of us said maybe if we went like 500 in the last 10, assuming we don't lose to DePaul, because that would just be, I mean, that's just the end of it, right? So as long as you don't lose to DePaul, you're still breathing. Let's say Butler does kind of split. I know it's hard this is a very hard, there's a lot of other teams playing and it's hard to predict this, but let's say Butler goes about 500 because Butler's been 500. Let's say they finish about 500 of the Big East, no DePaul loss. Where do you think that places? Do you think that they need to have a win in the tournament, or do you think that places them in a pretty good position to get a big, because the rest of their games other than DePaul are all Q1 and Q2 games. So there's really no bad losses left other than DePaul in there. So assuming they finish 500, they'd have good losses and really are good wins and not really terrible losses, assuming they don't the margins, right? Where do you think that puts them?
Yeah, I think if they go 500 and we assume, like you said, the wins are, if we do like the worst case scenario 4 and 4, which would be at DePaul, Xavier home, St. John's home, Providence home, lose the both 2 road games left, lose Marquette and Creighton, which obviously wouldn't be fun for anybody because that's losing 4 in a row in there. Yeah. So those 4 games are right after each other. And I just kind of doubt that Butler's going to lose 4 in a row. So I feel like they're going to win one of those. And if they go 500, it's going to be a St. John's or Xavier home loss because those teams are fighting for their life, clawing to try to get in 2. And they're good. Like I think Butler at home is better in that case, but they're good and everybody's scrambling at that point. Those are late February and then March. So they're kind of like, well, we don't really want a conference tournament win. We want to be safer. Xavier, who knows if they're going to be in the mix because they're just a lot closer. But I think Butler would be in for sure going into the Big East tournament at 4 and 4. Again, have to beat DePaul. If they lose to DePaul, I think you need to go 6 and 2, like that, including that loss, because it's just adding a quad 4 loss on March 2nd, 1 game before the Big East tournament, and it's to DePaul, which I've said it on multiple places. I've been on a couple different Big East things. I think DePaul is going to beat somebody. I do. I don't think they're going to finish with 3 wins.
Better not.
But I really like this Butler team, and I want to see them make the tournament. So I will be locked into that game like I've never been locked into DePaul before, hoping that it's just over at halftime. We just kick the shit out of them and it's done. But we'll obviously see how that goes on March 2nd. Obviously, if you go on this huge win streak, then maybe you could lose to them. Like we'll kind of have to see what it looks like on March 2nd. But I think you're definitely in the field. And again, I think because those 2 road wins are not going to age poorly unless there's some, wish on anybody, but like they'd have to have like multiple injuries per Marquette and Creighton for them to really just fall off that bad. Like those 2 teams are in the tournament. They're safe. They're solid single-digit seeds. So I think that's going to be such a great tiebreaker for Butler, and going 4 and 4, like you said, there's no more bad losses. Resume metrics are at worst going to stay idle, if not get a little bit better because you're adding good wins. So I'd say it's probably last 4 buys 11 at worst, or probably in the same spot as a 10. If some other bubble teams lose and it starts to cannibalize itself and some of the other like next 4 out under consideration teams win and they all just kind of cannibalize, then maybe Butler could get to a 9. But again, maybe a 10's better. So I think you're probably sitting more likely, more or less at the same spot right now as a 10 at 500, 5-3. You get to single digits, 6-2. We could be looking at Butler ceiling.
Awesome, man. And then the other question was, how many teams do you? I know there's a lot of talk. The Big East is basically bubble central right now. It's there's like 4 teams that are all sitting. I think Lunardi at one point had like 3 of them, or a lot of bracketologists had like 3 of them as their last 4 in. I actually didn't even know you could do. I legitimately didn't know like 2 teams from the same conference could even. I mean, it makes sense, could play in that last 4 in thing because. I mean, you're the last 4 in, right? So, what's your kind of projections? What are you seeing as far as how many Big East teams you see getting in this year?
Yeah, let me pull up the standings just so I don't forget somebody. So I would say from like a Big East standpoint, UConn and Marquette are locks. They're making the tournament. They could lose out. They're still in. I would say Creighton probably could. I think they're like whatever you'd call like near lock or whatever close, like 1 or 2 more wins, which would be shocking if they just went 0-8 to finish the year. But they're pretty good. They've been struggling a little bit lately, so we'll kind of leave that as almost lock. And then everybody else is bubble, and then Georgetown, DePaul are out. Obviously, they have to win the Big East tournament, and that would be pretty insane. Like even more than the Patrick Ewing one where Georgetown won, like that would be nuts. So I highly doubt that that's going to happen. So you're looking at 9 teams with a shot, 3 teams that are definitely getting in. My gut right now says 5. I would like to see 6 just because I like the Big East. But right now in my current field, I have 5. I have UConn, Marquette, Creighton, Butler, and St. John's. Seton Hall, Villanova are first 4 out. Providence is next 4 out. And then Xavier is like the 9th out, like the first team under consideration. So certainly you'd think like, okay, there's 5 in now. I think 6 has a really realistic shot, but that is only including 2 bid thieves. Richmond and Charlotte are my AQs, and the American and the A10, which both of those leagues, they only have 1 at-large team. You'd kind of have to think at least one of them is going to get a team to win the conference tournament that's not Dane or FAU. So that's 1 less bid that's in there. So I think that's relatively accurate, but I've seen some people say 7. I just don't know if I see that because there's just too many teams bubbly around there. Providence isn't playing great. Xavier and Villanova have an uphill climb with their overall record. Obviously, they still have a shot. I think they play each other today too, I believe, or tomorrow, today or tomorrow. So that's obviously a huge game. The loser, that's 12-11. That's not looking too great. You had an uphill climb just to get back to the overall record threshold. But I would say the most realistic is 5, but I think 6 is much more possible than 7.
Yeah, guys, anything else you want to ask?
Not for me.
Yeah, I think you did a great job explaining it all. I got nothing.
Sweet, love to hear it.
Yeah. Hey, well, T, really appreciate you coming on and breaking that down for us, man. That was actually awesome. way more information than I thought we were going to get, and I love it. Really appreciate you coming on. This is a fun time. As we all know, the Dogs play Saturday. Next up, Providence. Huge game for the Dogs, like we've talked about today. Providence Friars are also bubblicious, looking to try and get into the tournament. Home and Hinkle, I'm going to say this 1,000 times. Pack Hinkle, pack Hinkle, pack. There's no reason that should not be absolutely rowdy on Saturday, guys. Everyone get there and cheer on your Dogs, and let's get a W. Go Dogs.